All right. Hello, my name is Melissa Doherty, and I serve as the Science Communications Specialist for the Kentucky Academy of Science, a scientific society with 5,000 members and a mission to catalyze scientific communication and collaboration to improve research, education, and evidence-based public engagement within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In today's Sharing Your Science conversation, we are joined by KAS's Science Communications intern, Dr. Wilson Gonzalez Espada of Morehead State University, Dr. Zach DeVries of the University of Kentucky, and Dr. Jonalyn Gordon of the University of Florida, Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. For our June KAS newsletter, Dr. Gonzalez Espada featured our guest study about insecticide-resistant German cockroaches. And we're going to get into that today in our conversation. So Doctors Gordon and DeVries, if you wouldn't mind, can you guys each start by sharing a bit about your background, like where you studied and how you reached this point in your careers?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I got my undergraduate degree in zoology from Auburn University, and then proceeded to get a master's in entomology, also from Auburn University. From there, I moved to North Carolina State University and got my PhD and stayed on there for a bit as a postdoc before moving over to the University of Kentucky in late 2019, where I've been an assistant professor there, since that time.
So my name is Jonalyn Gordon, and I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Florida in wildlife ecology and conservation, and then worked on entomology, specifically termites, for my master's degree, also at the University of Florida, before moving up to Kentucky to the University of Kentucky and worked with Dr. Zachary DeVries for my PhD before returning to the University of Florida's Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center and starting an assistant professor position here just this past month.
Congrats on that position, and thank you guys for sharing that. Dr. Gonzalez Espada, if you could get us started on this topic of insecticide-resistant German cockroaches, which I'll be honest gives me a little bit of the heebie-jeebies, so I'm excited to learn a little bit more about this today. Can you tell us what drew you to this specific research piece for these sharing your science features that you are writing for us as our science intern or communications intern this summer?
Well, I agree with you. I am not a cockroach fan, particularly the flying variety that can just jump at you at any time. However, I thought it was interesting, the topic, because I know that a lot of people buy insecticide at the supermarket or the grocery store, and to realize that they may be wasting their money uh, on a product that is not effective and that could be harmful for them and their children. I thought that our audience should be able to learn a little bit more about that because most people have seen cockroaches around houses or buildings or their place of work.
Awesome. So I think you have some specific questions for our researchers about their work. So if you want to go in ahead and get started with that.
I do have a few, but I would like for them to just tell us about their study, how they became interested in this topic, and how they were able uh, to to complete their research, and then I will jump in with some additional questions.
Sure. So I can jump in. Maybe what might work best is I can kind of give like a broad background, and then I can let Jolin jump in and kind of fill in places I missed, but also get kind of the more specifics of how we drilled down, within this study. So as kind of a broad background, cockroaches have been one of these pests that have kind of plagued and bothered people for a very long period of time. And there's a lot of different species of cockroaches out there. We're really focused on what we call the German cockroach. This is one of the most prevalent cockroach species found worldwide, and it's a strictly indoor or structural pest. It's only associated with humans or human-built structures. And it causes a lot of problems for people. They are known to be able to pick up and potentially transmit pathogens. They have some psychological concerns, but probably our biggest concern with them is their allergens. They can produce and excrete a large number of allergens. These can accumulate in homes, lead to people having asthma, developing asthma, or having asthma, symptoms and morbidity. So major problem for a lot of people. And one of the biggest things is these tend to impact those in underserved communities. So those who lack the means or resources to pay for pest control oftentimes aren't usually able to get rid of them. And so we have a pest that causes a lot of problems, but it does so to those in disadvantaged communities. And so that's kind of one of the backbones of our focus on them, is trying to fix this, trying to find better ways of controlling them and rooting out some of these ineffective methods. And so kind of what got us into this general area of what I would call the DIY pest control sector is trying to understand all these products that are being put on shelves and marketed to people, to understand if they're actually doing what they say they're supposed to do. Most people don't have, say, a background in entomology or pest control, but if you're looking to control a pest, you walk into the store, if you read and see a picture of the bug you're trying to control on the label, the assumption is it's going to do just that. It's going to be able to kill or control that pest. And so we've worked in this broad area for quite a bit now of exploring a number of different products and finding some that work okay, but obviously finding others that don't necessarily do what they're supposed to do. So that's kind of a broad background which led us to this. And John, do you want to take it from there with some of the work you did?
Certainly. So I think just to expand on that, that real focus was to eventually be able to identify control strategies that could be applied by folks that are having pest problems, cockroach problems inside of their homes, and identifying which strategies with potentially limited resources and limited ability to approach cockroach control in their homes, what can they actually do to resolve the problem and reduce those potential health implications and risks to themselves and their families. And so that was and continues to be some of the end goal of the research that we're looking at.
Before we go into the details of the project, what makes cockroaches so successful in how they are so resilient, and how insecticides normally are supposed to work, and why are they not working?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I mean, there's a couple of things. It's not kind of one factor. It's multiple factors, I think, that make cockroaches such good pests. So they're living in our homes. These species have kind of, evolved to be successful indoors. And what that usually means is being able to survive, drier environments, typically speaking, because the home tends to be drier. It's harder to find water, access water typically. But these species have kind of evolved that have gotten to a position where there's no natural predators. So within a home, you think about a natural ecosystem, there's all these complex interactions among species. In the home, those interactions are dwindled down to very few interactions. And in our regular home, the predators that are there are non-existent or at numbers that can't control them. So you have a population within a home. If they have access to food and water, they grow unchecked. There's nothing other than us, the humans in those environments. There's nothing else there to kind of hold them back. So you've got a species that lives unchecked as long as it has access to food and water. Our homes typically have food and water within them, so it's fairly easy to find those, whether it's us spilling crumbs, having things that kind of fall down in places that we don't see but the pests can get to, having leaks and pipes and things where they can squeeze into and find little drops of water in places. So they've got food and water. They live in an unchecked environment. And what's happened over the years, another major factor is we've had, this evolution of resistance to pesticides, particularly pyrethroids, but also a number of other classes as well. So these insects have been, and you can think of it, a lot of people are more familiar with antimicrobial resistance, where antibiotics stop working. That's a more common one that people hear about. But we have pesticide resistance as well. So insecticide resistance in cockroaches. where through repeated exposure, we've killed off all the ones that are susceptible and we leave behind only the ones that are resistant. They grow, reproduce, and you have a population that shifts to one that is highly resistant to the chemicals that once were effective and now they're not working anymore. And maybe the only other thing I can think of off the top of my head would be nocturnal, their habits being a nocturnal pest. We don't see them or the full extent of an infestation. They tend to be hidden and in places where we don't notice them until we walk into a room and turn on the lights in the night or something else, and we see them scattered throughout a room.
Okay. And how about the insecticides? How do they chemically or physiologically are supposed to affect the cockroaches?
So it depends on the insecticide, particularly with the pyrethroids. As Zach had mentioned, they work on the insect's nervous system. And so they're targeting particular structures within the nervous system, the sodium channels, that eventually will cause paralysis and death in the insect under normal circumstances if they're operating properly. But one of the unique things about German cockroaches is that they do have a fairly quick life cycle. So they can go from egg to reproducing adult within about 3 months or so. And so that allows them to have very quick turnover in the population. And so individuals that have a mutation or that ability to not be as affected by that pyrethroid then are the ones that go on to reproduce, and you can eventually end up with a population that's completely saturated with resistant individuals fairly quickly for German cockroaches because of how quickly you can get that population turnover. And pyrethroids were the active ingredient in all of the spray and aerosol products that we tested as part of this study. And for the vast majority of consumer cockroach spray and aerosol products do use pyrethroids, one or several, as part of their as the active ingredient in that product. And so that, as Zach had alluded to, part of the problem is this constant usage of these over the decades has then allowed most, if not all, populations across the world of German cockroaches to have fairly high levels of resistance to pyrethroids, which would therein render these products that use pyrethroids as their active ingredients completely ineffective.
Okay. Now that you mentioned the different the insecticides, can you tell us a little bit how did you get your cockroaches? How did you test them? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the best way that we find, there's a couple of different ways that you could collect cockroaches. You can tweeze them one by one, pick them up with forceps. That's pretty time consuming. It doesn't work too well. Cockroaches are also attracted to beer and bread inside of traps, but putting those inside of someone's home also doesn't work terribly well. So the best solution that our lab, as well as other labs, have is to vacuum them up. So we use a modified, and I can let Zach talk a little bit more about the design. We use a modified vacuum in order to collect cockroaches in homes that we're working in. And we take them back to the lab, rear them out, and we are able to then to use them for laboratory experiments, which allow us to understand their behavior under more controlled environments and also give us an idea of what their resistance profiles look like for pyrethroids as well as other active ingredients.
Do you
Yeah.
just knock on somebody's house? Hey, can I vacuum your cockroaches? Or how do you find the participants?
Yeah, so we a number of different ways. So we actually do. I mean, it might sound fairly simple, but we do a lot of knocking on doors and what we, recruiting people for, in our case, it's usually free research studies. We usually get some perplexed looks because normally, people might think we're trying to sell something or provide, and it's like, and then when they find out we're there to provide free roach control, it sounds like it's too good to be true. And then a lot of times our studies, if people participate and complete the study, we actually pay them. So when they do all the math, they sit there and say, you're coming to our house to control the cockroaches for free, and you're going to pay us at the end of this for controlling our cockroaches. People usually don't believe it off the top, and we have to say, no, we promise this. We're not, this is not a gimmick. It's like we really are here as researchers. And so, but so a lot of knock on doors. We develop rapport within communities that we work in, though. So oftentimes when we get into somebody's home, once we've worked in there for a bit, word can kind of spread in a community, and it can be passed around that we are who we say we are, and we're actually there to help and improve things. And I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but I do think it's important because a lot of people deal with roaches, but there's kind of a distinction. So when we're talking about German roaches, we're talking about roaches where we're finding these in homes, where we're finding dozens to hundreds to sometimes thousands of them in areas. We're not talking about the bigger ones. In Kentucky, usually people will see what we call the American roach or the Oriental cockroach. Those are the two species that are a little bit larger that we find commonly in the state. And those you'll find, but you usually find a couple, a few, not massive numbers. We're talking about ones that are in, like I said, the hundreds to often thousands within very confined places. So it's not something that everybody's always used to hearing or seeing. And we'll make sure we share some videos with you as well that some of the viewers, so people can see and understand what exactly some people are living with, what conditions and things they're dealing with in terms of these. It's not just one annoying roach. This is something that's a massive infestation and a very real problem for them.
Okay. Okay. Can you share how the testing occur? I know you have three different types of roaches, and you try spraying them directly or walking them on over surfaces. Can you explain that a little bit?
Certainly. So for the populations that we tested, we have what we call a laboratory susceptible population. It's our control population actually collected in Orlando, I believe in the 1980s. And so that population represents one where the individuals have not had any exposure to most of the modern insecticides that we see used for German cockroach control. And so it represents this blank slate where we expect them to die with contact to any insecticides. In fact, if you look at them funny, they don't do terribly well. So we really do expect those to die. And that gives us context for how these insecticides should work on a population that doesn't have any resistance at all. We also used several populations of what we call field collected, home collected, resistant cockroaches. So those were ones that were collected from homes. Two of the populations were collected in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then one was actually collected in Kentucky. So that those populations, we were able to calculate the degree of resistance to pyrethroids that they have compared to that control population to get an idea of how resistant they are to pyrethroids. And then we applied those three different treatments. So the direct application, which is a best case scenario for efficacy for that product. So if you spray a cockroach with it, we really expect it to die if that product is effective on that particular population. And then the two others were residual, where they were applied to a surface, that surface was allowed to dry, and then cockroaches were introduced. And those are a lot more realistic to how we see these products being applied inside of homes, where people would apply them to a surface. It's going to be nearly impossible, if not impossible, to find and directly treat every single cockroach inside of a home. So most of the time, people are spraying them on surfaces, and cockroaches are supposed to crawl across that surface to come in contact with the insecticide. So our two residuals were one where it was a limited amount of time on that treated surface, which would be something like a cockroach walking across it and coming in contact with that insecticide just for that small pass. And then the other was under, again, a best case scenario for residual efficacy. If we keep them in contact with those treated surfaces, how long does it take the cockroach to die under that context?
Okay, and now we want the results. So what did you find about these different about these insecticides?
So for the direct exposure, as expected, a lot of cockroaches of all across all the populations did die with being directly sprayed with the products. But interestingly, for those home collected populations, about 25%, so a quarter of those population product combinations did not do very well. So what we were doing is looking at a 90% threshold, which is based on the EPA testing guidelines for direct exposure. And
So wait,
again,
you spray them directly, and not all of them died?
correct.
Wow, that is unexpected.
Absolutely. So again, that's a best case scenario. If you're spraying it directly on them, it really, really should work. Now, all of the susceptible population, all of the control population did die with that direct
Mhm.
application, which is important when we look later at some of the other tests that we did. So interestingly, there was again not that complete mortality. So then when we looked at the limited exposure that on the residual applications, that discrepancy was even greater, magnified. So there was a real difficulty for across all of the products for them to be effective against the uh, populations that were home collected. So the ones that had demonstrated pyrethroid resistance, we saw really greatly reduced mortality. What was the most interesting is that on a porous surface, so painted drywall, if you think about uh, walls or close to baseboards where products might be applied, even the cockroaches that are susceptible, the ones that you look at them funny and they die, those did not die with products that were applied to those porous surfaces. So that was very, very surprising to us. And that's been the direction of some additional research that we're going to look into.
So essentially, I can spend money, I can cover surfaces with these insecticides. They can go in and out, they can skate on it, they will probably not die.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I mean you're when you're looking to control German cockroaches, you're not gonna get there. And it's not surprising that we go into so many homes and we see a lot of the products that we actually tested. They have these, and not just one, they have multiple of them, and they're continuing to use them. But the reason they keep using them is not because there's new roaches showing up, it's because they can't kill the ones that are currently there. A lot of times those cans or bottles, jugs would be more useful if they use it to smash the roaches rather than spraying the roaches, and probably safer for them and their families as well.
I was gonna say yeah, it will be easier if you drown them with the insecticide rather than kill them chemically. Now we have all of these insecticides in our houses. We use it more. The cockroaches do not die, but we may get some health effects. Can you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I can mention a little bit, and I will qualify this right off the bat with I'm trained in entomology, not in necessarily in human toxicology or exposure, but I can speak to it a little bit in terms of the areas where I feel like I know this. And in the current study, we didn't actually go and look at residues within homes, but in a previous study where we used some other similar products called bug bombs or total release foggers or aerosols, these are one of these devices where you kind of pull a pin or you drop it in some water and it releases this mist of insecticide that basically is supposed to bomb the house. It's supposed to cover the house in insecticide. Incredibly dangerous, and they contain pyrethroids, so you might not be surprised to hear they don't work. They don't control cockroaches. They don't control bed bugs. They don't work for a lot of things they're designed to work for. But in that study, we actually did swabbing throughout the home. So what was amazing is that these things, they do what they're supposed to do. They put pesticides everywhere, middle of the floor, countertops. They put pesticides everywhere. They don't really get them where the roaches are. And when they do, they don't kill them anyways. But they put these residues everywhere. And these sprays are, we didn't do this in a study, but you can think of it in the same framework. People are using these and spraying them everywhere, usually cracks and crevices and corners, but they're getting applied liberally. So there's no, when a homeowner gets their hands on this, if they're going to apply them wherever they think they might need to be applied. And so they may or may not read or follow the label exactly. And so you're going to get, in both cases, you're going to get residues of these all over the place. Obviously, they're not controlling cockroaches, but there's a human exposure risk to this. So when we talk about bug bombs, we talk about, you think about coming back into home, you sit your kids down, they start crawling all over the floor and then start licking their hands. You get a lot of immediate exposure, which is of concern. And the way I usually break it down is pyrethroids of all the insecticides we have are relatively safe in terms of human exposure. So I don't want people thinking that it's like these are they're going to go out and get me. It's like, no, we've used these, and when they're used appropriately, following the label, these things can be very safe. The problem is there's an inherent risk with anything, with any exposure to any chemical. There's a potential risk. It could be infinitely small, but there is still some risk depending on exposure and dosage and what you bump into. We usually balance that risk with the benefit. So in the case of pest control products, the benefit should be controlling the pest. So we have minimal exposure, low risk to humans, but if we're controlling a pest, okay, that maybe outweighs that potential risk. In the case of the products we're talking about here with this study, they didn't do anything. They didn't control anything. So it's very hard to justify, even if the risk from exposure is very small, it's hard to justify it because there is no benefit. You have a small exposure risk and you have no benefit to show for that. So that's usually how I break it down here is that we really want to have a benefit to justify the exposure use and ultimately exposure risk to chemicals.
You mentioned in an email that, and in the study talked about cockroach uh, baits, and how is that different from the insecticides? And I think you have some preliminary results about baits.
Yes. So the when we look at cockroach baits, this is essentially the toxicant, but it's inside of an edible matrix. And so typically we see the baits applied as a gel in small applications. Pea-sized applications is usually what we recommend in a bunch of different places. But the key there is that we as a research team, professional pest control operators, and then consumers with the consumer bait products can apply them very targeted to areas where the cockroaches would be. So in those cracks and crevices, in areas where they're not going to come in contact with pets or with children. And so inherently there's a reduced risk of exposure with the bait. So that's why predominantly across all urban entomology labs and within urban entomology extension, baits are recommended over these aerosol or spray insecticides. So we did a sister study to this where we looked at consumer bait products. So there's gel baits as well as some newer liquid bait products. And then the bait stations. So roach motels, I think is the term for them, that are those little black containerized baits. So that has been published in the Journal of Economic Entomology as well. And what we found was that in the lab, a lot of these products work really, really well. And there's a strong comparison between these consumer bait products and the professional in terms of their efficacy, little differences in terms of how long it took to get to efficacy, but efficacy was pretty strong. Now, this is where we did an in-home study where we actually went out into people's homes and applied these products and looked at the time to reduction of population of cockroaches in those homes. And that's where we started to see this separation where professional products that we evaluated as a positive control were able to reduce those populations in the home within that 1 month timeline. Some of the consumer products, we looked at a liquid bait, we are able to do that in that 1 month timeline, but some of the other consumer bait products took a lot longer. And so when we think about these potential risks to health with mechanical transmission of disease, with asthma as a result of the allergens, 4 months is a really, really long time to wait for populations to be reduced inside of a home.
Yeah, because you say 1 month, and you said it took 3 months from a little cockroach to become adult, and that's, by the time some of them die, the other ones are already teenagery and on their way to become adults, right? Now, so some of these products are not working as they should. So would you recommend people to find some professional help to control the cockroaches? And what if their landlord, if they're renting, the landlord, they don't want to invest the money in that?
Yeah, I mean it gets very tricky when you get into who pays for this. So if I back up more broadly, there are certain pests where I feel like if people feel comfortable, I don't have a problem recommending them trying to manage them on their own. German cockroaches are one of a handful where I would say that's probably should be left to professionals. That's one that can be very tricky. It can be very difficult for people to deal with on their own. That said, that's like, my best option here. A lot of times people don't have that choice. So like you just mentioned a scenario where maybe the property management is supposed to be in charge of this or their landlord and they're not doing a good job. Oftentimes, if people don't have the means or resources, that's where they've got to turn. I think John mentioned this earlier, but it's like they've got to turn to these over-the-counter products. And that's where I mean I hate to be the bearer of bad news or a Debbie Downer, but we don't have great options. We're kind of in a point where it's like what we've explored so far is your bug bombs don't work, your residual sprays don't work, and now we're getting to a point where I don't want to say baits don't work, but baits work slowly. The consumer baits that people have access to are not working fast enough, and most people aren't going to have the patience. They're not going to be able to wait 3 or 4 months, whether it's for medical reasons or whether it's just this you know basically desire to get rid of this problem a lot faster. The patience is usually not there. When you treat for things, you just don't expect it to take 4 months for it to have that kind of effect. So we're kind of in this really stuck scenario where ultimately, it comes down to how these products have been put on the shelves in the first place, what's been allowed to get through. And that's where John mentioned earlier a little bit about this 90% threshold. And we talked a little bit about this Orlando normal population, which has been in the lab for decades. So one of the reasons, and this is, I don't want to say the only reason, but one of the reasons behind some of the failures we see and why some of these products make and persist on shelves is if I want to register a product for German cockroach control, for cockroach control in general, I've just got to test that susceptible lab population. I don't have to go out and get new ones that are in people's homes right now or in commercial kitchens, other places. I've just got to use that one that's been in the lab for a long time. If I show efficacy there, and it's a little more complicated than this, but if it works on that one, I'm good to go. That allows me to get German cockroach approved and on the label. And it's something we've been trying to push back with. It's been a little bit of a challenge, but I'm hoping that we can continue our discussions with the EPA to make some shifts around this and use some of the data we have to maybe make changes to policy. But it's concerning. It's a really major concern right now that those laboratory susceptible populations, you look at them funny, they die. Those are the ones we're using to justify registering all of the products that we see on shelves right now. So they're very scary and concerning.
So you would suggest having a lab controlled resistant roach population that you can then compare in a more realistically way and test it?
Yeah, there's a number of solutions. I mean, simply put, if you told me right now that you're testing a population, even if it was collected 10 years ago, I would be happier. That would be a enormous step forward compared to what we're doing right now. It doesn't, at this point, it's like it doesn't even have to be perfectly designed. It just needs to be better than using this decades old laboratory population because those are not reflective of what people actually see or are trying to control. And when we keep using those, we're going to find one thing in the lab, just like if you look in the study, the roaches that were susceptible, how everything worked on them. And these products look like they're magic. And that's what they were when they first came out. But they don't do that anymore because of resistance development, they're failing. So you're not seeing the real picture. When these products are getting registered, the real picture isn't being shown.
Okay. Well, Melissa, you had a question about adversity?
Yeah, so I've found this all very, very fascinating, and I think it's interesting from the science side, but it's also interesting from the, homeowner and, someone who's renting, like it's a very, scientific work, but you have a very human aspect to it. And I think that's, it makes for a great conversation because, we've got these things where, you know, I'm trying something and it's not working, and my neighbor's trying something and it's not working. And how do we, move forward with that? And so, I think it lends itself to not just the validity of your work, but the importance of people leaning on science and trusting that scientists are trying to, address issues and help solve problems. One of the things that we want to just ask you all is to think about a time where maybe you have faced adversity, professionally or, in a research project where things just didn't go well and didn't go right, and how you got through that, how you worked through that, and how maybe that has helped shape you as a researcher and a scientist, because part of what KAS does is encourage young scientists from a very early age up through undergraduates and on. And so how can you all talk to, an issue where maybe you've had some adversity or things didn't go well, and provide maybe a little bit of wisdom and encouragement for those that might be listening.
So I guess I can speak to the bait study that we did, which involved being in people's homes and working in homes and going out. So it took the study was conducted from July of 2021 to January of 2024, which is a fairly long time to be out every single week in the snow. I'm from Florida, so I don't do snow very well, in the rain and going out and doing that work and inherently working in people's homes and seeing the level of cockroach populations that Zach had described. It's challenging because this is something that people are dealing with, and ultimately there's a lot of social stigma associated with cockroach problems in homes. And as we built these relationships with the folks whose homes we were working in and heard their stories, and they talked about the health impacts that they felt were being caused by the cockroaches, it's definitely emotionally taxing in a lot of ways. And ultimately, everybody deserves to live in a pest-free home. We have the tools, as Zach had mentioned, we have the technology. It's just how we get those things into the right places. But it certainly solidified for me and strengthened my resolve that this is why I do the work I do. This is why I'm really excited to be in the position I'm in, because working in structural pest management, the research that we do can have those really direct applications in improving quality of life for people. And that's something that I carry with me every single day, in the highs and lows of a work day, that's why I'm here. And so that's been really impactful and kind of has shaped my trajectory in terms of being a scientist.
Yeah, so if I was going to follow up on that, I guess I have maybe two things. One that's maybe more specific and one that's general in terms of, handling adversity in science. So as part of this study, I mean, you see what I like to think like the nice finished product of this. And I think what oftentimes is not always clear to folks is that there's a lot more that went into it before. And then there's a lot of failure and trial and error and things that happened first. And so like this study, one of our original goals here is we were again trying to put things in the hands of we were trying to find things that were accessible and effective and put those in the hands of those who maybe were lacking in terms of pest control, whether it's services or efficacy or things. And so our original goal here was actually to take these baits and it was to test them with some education of homeowners or residents of apartments and let them start doing it themselves. Because we kind of walked into this thing. It's like, oh, we've used professional baits. It's like these homeowner ones, these are going to be fine. These will work very well. We started this study and we felt very confident in our ability to bait and we were failing, not just the residents, we were failing to control things. And so kind of as an adversity moment, it's like, this whole, study's falling apart now. It's like, what are we going to do? This is kind of the rug being pulled out from underneath us. And so, but instead of, there's maybe a moment of panic or confusion or frustration, but then you pivot. And so we looked at this and we said, hey, this is a problem, but we turned it into an opportunity here where we were able to take this and essentially mold it into a project that could show we're struggling. And on these consumer products, even the ones we expected to work are not working the way that they should be working. And so we took something that could have been a really bad thing and maybe turned it into something I think has been really important to get out there. It's not not the best message that we wanted. It's not what we were hoping to share with everybody, but nonetheless, it's important so that we can ultimately move the system forward. So we can move things to a place where ultimately people can live in pest-free homes. So I would say that's kind of maybe the specific thing. The general thing, which I alluded to earlier, is that just in science in general, and I, having done this for a while now, it's like, you see all the published papers and you see all the outputs, which they usually look awesome, not just from our field, but like all fields. It's really neat to see things. But you don't see what went into that. You don't see how many experiments failed, how many things you had to try different ways, and how many times you had to push through, or even sometimes how many projects had to be abandoned. How many things did you have to say, look, this is not what we need to do. We need to pivot and move in a different direction. So this is maybe more for those on the younger end of just getting into the science or getting their feet wet, is to not, it's easy to say, but it's like, don't be afraid of failure. That's part of the process here. And as long as you can find something to learn or take away from that, I think that you can keep advancing yourself, professionally, but also your field, and you can move things forward. But it's going to happen, and just because you might not see it in the final works, it happens. I've never met anybody who just set up a project, did everything that they said they were going to do, it worked perfectly, and then they published it, and that was it. There's always a backstory that you don't see or understand with those works.
Definitely. And I think that's something that we kind of hope to highlight with these stories is, you have this, neatly tied, well articulated and with images and graphs and things that look really nice in the, publication, or even, presenting at a conference. You always have these, very well put together, well, practiced presentations and papers, but all of the time and all of the energy and all of the rewrites and reworks and retests of your experiments to get things to a point where you can have that finished product, where sometimes it can be a little misleading that yes, you see this beautiful finished product, or you see this something on even on social media scrolling, and you see this article in Science, so hey, this is this fantastic study. Well, what you don't necessarily hear is about the 3 years that you all were out in the field pulling populations and testing the application of these products. And I think that's something that, as we continue to mentor and teach our upcoming scientists, we also have to teach them about the ability to pivot and about the ability to fail, because that's not something I ever learned in any of my studies, either of my degrees, to fail. You just have to kind of adapt and go through it. So thank you guys for sharing that perspective. I think that's really useful and interesting. I do want to know what's next in terms of what you guys are working on. Are there more cockroach studies in the works, or kind of what are your next steps there? And then where can people follow your work or learn more about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I can say, I mean, broadly, this work it's been really fascinating to find, but maybe one of the good things we took out of the last paper is there are some potential products that the OMRs have access to that seemed like they were working okay. And so we've now taken that and are starting to expand. This is something that John and I are still doing in collaboration, also with New York City Housing Authority and some other folks, expanding this study out and starting to explore some of these novel strategies. It's using liquid baits essentially to control these cockroaches. And so in the first study, it was kind of like this like small snippet of like, hey, this looks really promising. And we're now expanding that out to see if it really holds water. So we think there's some hope. We think that there's some options for people that might be effective, affordable, and then ultimately sustainable. But we'll find out. That's why it's in progress here.
And just to add to that, that the hope is always when you do a research study that it leads to when you answer the question, you now have a dozen more questions that you're able to answer, or that you're able to now pursue and ask. And so out of this study, exactly what Zach had said, there's lots more questions to help us move the needle, at least to some degree, we hope, in terms of getting that accessible cockroach control to the populations that need it the most.
And where can we follow your work? Do you guys have, websites or social media where you're, kind of posting updates or learn more about what you're doing?
So we have a website at the University of Kentucky. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but it's the DeVries Labs at the University of Kentucky, where we do an okay job of getting updated. We're not, yeah, I hate to profess I'm not super social media savvy right now. But we do get our work out there. And I think other places that, people can look to are, Pest Control Technologies, a magazine that often will cover things, and they can do so in a somewhat accessible way so that everybody can read things. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys covering this. This is great to kind of share our work with the broader academic community and scientists within Kentucky. Yeah.
I'll echo both of those sentiments in that I have not done a very good job at being active on social media, and I'm still working on getting websites up related to my program. So I don't have a landing pad yet, but thank you so much for your time and for reaching out to both of us.
Thank you guys for the work that you're doing. Great.
Yeah, we're very happy that you guys were able to take the time to share this with us, not only for the newsletter piece, but also for this conversation, which is the first of this kind that we're doing. So thank you guys for being our guinea pigs and
Uh,
for letting us, interview you and get to know more about your work. Just for those that are listening, the Kentucky Academy of Science is on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So make sure that you like and follow us on all of those platforms. Thank you
and one
again to go ahead.
Sorry. Just wanted to make sure because I didn't mention it early, but it's something I should mention is how appreciative we are. So this work that was done and is ongoing now was funded through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, U.S. HUD, and so that's at a time where funding is maybe can be challenging to find. They've been instrumental in doing this and then continuing this work and have really allowed us to we think move this field forward. Yeah.
That's incredible. And that's not one of those typical agencies that you hear, NIH or NSF
Hmm.
funding, research. So I think that's great to get that word out there as well that,
Yeah.
encourage scientists to think outside of the box when it comes to your funding, think beyond, those big federal, not that one's, obviously that one is a federal agency, but, kind of think outside the box and really strategize about what population you're serving and what your goal of your research is, and maybe try and connect to some unique and different
Yeah.
funding sources. But I think that's a great point to share, and I appreciate that you
Yeah.
guys again have taken the time to chat with us today.